Oh, one. Let's start. Oh, one.
Hello everyone, thank you everybody for coming there.
Oh, one.
Hello everyone, thank you everybody for coming there.
Oh, one.
Hello everyone, thank you everybody for coming there.
Oh, one.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming there.
Oh, one.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming there. Hello everyone, thank you. The concept of formal readings in the discourse of architectural value. In today's special lecture, Andrew Saunders from Philadelphia will refer to Baroque Topologies surviving of radical analysis. The online lecture will be followed by an open discussion moderated by Metaform team. Andrew Saunders is an associate professor of architecture and the director of the Master of Architecture professional degree program at University of Pennsylvania and founding principal of Andrew Saunders Architecture plus Design. As a designer, scholar, and faculty member within the discipline of architecture, Saunders specialized in computational geometry as it's related to aesthetics, material culture, and advanced technology and fabrication. His approach to practice, research, and teaching reflects contemporary design technology as a critical lens of design instruments for researching how the material culture of architecture and design are generated and conveyed. So without further introduction, great pleasure to welcome Andrew Saunders. So I will give the words to Andrew.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be invited to this amazing lecture series you guys have put together. So congratulations to you guys as well. I was watching a few of the lectures that you've recorded. They're really good. I'm happy to be invited to discuss formal analysis, and I want to put forth kind of a project that I've recently been working on and maybe talk about its relationship to formal analysis. There's quite a few aspects of it. But I'm going to talk tonight a little bit about sort of surveying and how surveying and the Baroque are related to formal analysis at a certain point. And I'll go through that. I'll try to go through it quickly. I have a lot of slides. We have a lot of information. It's a pretty vast survey that was conducted. But there's certainly a lot of different questions and aspects of the project. So I'm certainly willing to discuss that a little bit later. Should I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's. Okay, everything good? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit tonight. There's I just recently published a book titled Baroque Topologies. It's a really, actually it's a pretty small book here. It was intentionally made to be kind of small and portable and inexpensive. So if anyone's traveling to Rome or the Piedmont area, you can easily kind of pick it up and take it with you. I'm going to talk about this kind of some of the work that's in the book. But first I wanted to kind of just talk about my sort of take on formal analysis and maybe make an argument that the Baroque is at the heart of formal analysis. So, sorry. You didn't see this.
Yeah, it's black. Maybe we can share it again.
Okay. Let's see.
Now it's okay.
And you see the surveying tools?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to go to full screen. Are you seeing it now, or is it black?
Yes, we can.
And you see the slides? Yeah. Do you see the slides changing?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, thank you. That would be embarrassing to do the whole lecture with one slide. Yeah. Okay, so sorry, I was just talking about Henrik Wolflin and the sort of origins of the Baroque and how that is also tied in with the origins of formal analysis, right? So Henrik Wolflin wrote in 1888, famous book, The Renaissance and the Baroque. Before that, in 1886, 2 years before that, he was finishing his dissertation, which is on the psychology of architecture, where, Wolflin is one of the key founders, along with Elos Regal, of formalism and the whole kind of formalist approach in art and architecture. And when he was working on his dissertation, he was looking at psychoanalytical techniques, specifically empathy theory and a number of others. And he wrote his dissertation, which was on the psychology of architecture. After that, he had to write a second book in order to teach. And so his second book is this Renaissance and Baroque book, where, in my mind, he had to find, just as a psychologist, he had to find sort of a deviant kind of patient or a deviant architecture. And the entire book is kind of dedicated to the sort of analysis of the Baroque in comparison to the Renaissance. So for the Renaissance, he uses these terms of elegant, harmonious, graceful, light, self-contained, individualistic, tectonic, calm, beautiful, uniform, perfect, born easily, free, complete, broad, pleasing, satisfactory, heavenly, content, slow, quiet, enduring, and fulfilled. And then on the other hand, he uses the terms, or kind of assesses the Baroque, which, at that point was not necessarily an architecture that many people looked at, and certainly not favorably. And he kind of addresses that as broad, massive, heavy, dissonant, amorphous, formless, imprisoned, unevolved, incomplete, immediate, intimidating, overwhelming, exciting, ecstatic, intoxicating, momentary, desolating, anticipating, dissatisfactory, restless, and tense. So there was kind of a very kind of beginning of formalism is this idea of being able to kind of assess form through these psychoanalytical techniques and kind of understand an architecture that really was kind of without a canon, in the sense that the Renaissance had quite a few treaties that were written about it within the kind of rule structure. Alberti, certainly one of the principles, and the Baroque was less so defined. So it was important to kind of assess the Baroque with these new formal tactics. So go on to surveying. What I'd like to kind of present is surveying on sort of twofold. One is the literal act of surveying. So here you see kind of an abbreviated history of surveying and the surveying tools that were used predominantly. Many people believe surveying began with the Egyptians, with the rope stretchers who were in charge of reconstructing property lines after the Nile was flooded. So you see here, these are kind of just using simple rope. They're able to devise certain trigonometric principles and measure new property zones. You go on to other properties, other tools of the Egyptians, with the A-frame level, the Marquette Sundial were typical. And the thing that these all have in common is they basically measure straight lines. The whole thing is about generating straight lines and being able to measure them. Then you have the Romans, which you have the hodometer, which is a surveying wheel. I mean, these are all pretty fascinating devices. The dioptra, the chorobates, which is mentioned in Vitruvius, which is kind of a leveling device. The Groma, which divided cities for the Romans. You can still see the imprint of this on many previously settled Roman cities. You have the Astrolabe. Compass and ruler is probably one of the most critical points, because the Egyptians, through Euclid, established their geometry based on two real simple principles, basically the arc and the chord. So all geometry that the Greeks developed had to be developed from either the arc, which is a circle or half circle, or in the straight line, which is the chord. These principles obviously overlap with the history of representation as well, and especially architectural representation. I would include, within this kind of drafting, then also the pinhole camera, or the camera obscura, also deals with creating image through the straight lines of light and points on a surface, leading up to Alberti's drawing machines, which are projecting points to surface, points and lines. Alberti had a number of different surveying or measuring devices. Here's one, which was the Definitor, or the Finatorum, which actually measured sculptures in order to reconstruct exact, let's say, figural features. And then, modern surveying equipment, which is the theodolite, and then finally the 3D laser scan. So I would argue that there's kind of a long history of surveying that's interlinked with architectural representation, all that kind of revolve around the idea of measurement and generating straight lines. This is the kind of current state of surveying. This is a Faro laser scanner. This is one that I used and took with me, and pretty much scanned mostly by myself. I had sometimes had some help. What's nice about the technology now, that it's come so far, also mixed with the idea that computationally, once you scan in different locations, you can register or put all the scans together automatically. So it's really, maybe a few years before I did this project, one would have needed to put physical targets or spheres or patches around so that you could then match those points, which would have been pretty much impossible to do within all of these churches. So this kind of survey that I did takes place right at the sort of threshold when it's possible to start doing this in a very mobile, portable way. I'm going to talk a little bit about three sort of radical surveys that I would say that I would go into the third one probably the most, but I just wanted to put some of these out there, and talking about survey not only just as a methodology or a practice, but also its representation. There's representation that's very much linked to the methods that survey that have radically altered our kind of understanding of architecture, cities, and architectural representation. This is probably familiar to most people. This is the famous Noli map, 1748, considered the first sort of scientific mapping of Rome. Everyone is pretty much familiar with the center part. Maybe you're not familiar with over here on the kind of far right side, there's a small angel that's drawing on this rotating drafting table. And this rotating table was essential, that allowed Noli to operate within the field and actually do all of these measurements and do this continuing drawing, and allowed the map to happen. So it was sort of a early laser scanner in a certain sense. Obviously, the graphic representation of this the seemingly binary representation, that spaces that were public would be white, and then other private spaces would be completely pochade or have this kind of deep dark hatch. So what's interesting is that the public spheres of something like Piazza Navona that are outdoor also start to link into something like San Magnesi, which is linked to this. So this idea of inside outside is broken down into public flowing from inside to outside. So there starts to become a really interesting ambiguity from such a really binary set of representation. Another survey that I found pretty radical in terms of representation is Auguste Soizet. He's a French engineer. Was really interested in the beginning, kind of documenting this Roman construction. he then devises a way in which to document and construct these very quickly without the use of perspective. And so he looks at the worm's eye axon, which he's made famous with a number of these kind of drawings. Within that sort of worm's eye axon, what's interesting is he really wanted to show the kind of vaults at that time. And there starts to become this focus on interior. How can one show the interior of architecture without a perspective drawing? So we're always kind of looking up at these heavy, massive Roman constructions, but we're also looking into and seeing the interior of those vaulting. By the time at the end of it, he's writing a history now. Now he's writing a whole history of architecture from the viewpoint of these worm's eye axons. So he's only giving fragments of these buildings. He's never showing exterior or any relationship to city. He's only showing through these kind of reduced axons the interior vaulted space of Sorry, are you guys there?
We are, but your screen disappeared.
All right, let me share screen again. Good?
Yes.
Actually, sorry. Okay, sorry. It's good now?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, well, I'm saying that this became a radical way to tell the story of an entire architecture history only through the interiors and only through the bays, but also surveying was not limited to just surveying and documenting one building. The survey becomes of an entire sequence or series of architecture. For this, for Swazi, it was the history of architecture becomes surveyed. I'm going to focus maybe a little bit more on this one, which I think has some pretty explicit relationships with the research that I've done. This is a survey done by Luigi Moretti. It was done with he and his students for the architecture magazine Spazio in 1953. Spazio is the Italian for space, and this magazine was also started and graphically designed by Luigi Moretti, who was a modernist architect. Probably for most people in the US, his famous building is the Watergate building. So whenever you see an image of the Watergate scandal, you always see Moretti's famous complex. But the point being that he was, a kind of very involved academically, but also in sort of a late modern mode. But he takes the time to do this survey of the interior works. The survey is called Sequence of Structures. The structures and sequences of space. These then are documents of most of them Italian interior sequences that happen throughout the history of Italian architecture. So this is the beginning page here, the title, Spazio. So what he's trying to do is trying to kind of take a survey and go from early Italian architecture all the way and sort of with Baroque and late kind of architecture to show the differences of those kind of sequences of space. He does this by this kind of new radical representational mode of casting the volumes of the interior. So what you're seeing is not the actual churches or the buildings, but you're only seeing the volume of this. Now this survey, this one is Adrian's Villa. The survey is influenced quite a bit by another German historian, August Schmarsal, who was probably the first person to theorize space or the concept of space within architecture. And Schmarsal is advocating for space as the real creation of architecture, the most essential creation, and arguing that then architecture is not a practical art, but it's more universal as a fine art. And he's also advocating that space is determined through motion, not only physical motion, but the way in which your eye works and then can perceive depth and space. And, finally, Schmarsal argues that the interior is the most important part of architecture, not the exterior. So you can see it's aligned a bit with the previous Schmarsal kind of focus on the interior. And so this whole study is looking at these interior sequences. This one is for St. Peter's Basilica, which had a number of additions through history, looking at that. These are other Italian works, Palazzo Farnese. This is another Guarini unbuilt project. And this. So I would present in the sort of light of those. This work that I've been doing, Baroque Topologies, is another form of surveying. In the survey, I look at 6 architects. So there are 4 architects from Rome, Italy, and then there are 2 other architects that kind of carry on this inquiry into the sort of centrally planned church in the Baroque that are operating within the Piedmont area, which is Torino and its outside area. So they're generally just 6 architects that you really need to know. Obviously, there are other Baroque, but I think these are the most important. There's obviously Francesco Borromini, who I would say is the mason. One thing is interesting, these architects are not necessarily trained as architects like we are today, right? They all have different kind of upbringing, different education that lead them to making architecture. So, for instance, you have Gianni Lorenzo Bernini, he's a sculptor by trade. He is sort of a child prodigy of the sculptor, comes to architecture much later after developing these sculptures into interior models and then finally into full freestanding churches. Pietro de Cortona is primarily a painter, incredible paintings, and you can start to see how these kind of painterly tropes start to affect the way in which he operates in architecture. I would say probably the one that's most kind of architectural is Carlo Rinaldi, who has sort of education in northern Italy before kind of coming to Rome. And then, 100 years later, you have Guarini in Torino, and then his kind of sort of direct sort of descendant who helped to finish Guarini's book is Bernardo Vittoni, who was, so if you look at this, you can see the sort of evolution of the Baroque centrally planned churches from the Borromini or Cortona all the way up to Vittoni, where these interiors just become increasingly complex, delaminated, the space starts to peel apart, and you get this very intricate and daring sort of load-bearing vaulting. Everything is still at this point load-bearing masonry vaulting. So this is the survey, and these are kind of the buildings by those 6 architects you can start to see. And then obviously there's a bit of allusion to the Moretti cast here. And I'm going to go through, a few different, what I would call representational modes or novel representation modes that we can start to look at through using LiDAR or laser scanning. The sort of default output of that is a point cloud. The point cloud allows you to access a point in space that has 3D coordinates, and then it also has a color assigned to each point. So what you're looking at here is a rendered version of the point cloud of Borromini's San Carlino. And they become really interesting models because they're all focused on the interior. So it gives you a total glimpse of the interior that you've never seen before. Also, there's a really interesting transparency that starts to happen. So we're seeing from the outside the inside, so we can start to look through that sort of shell and see the interior. So you're seeing all of that in multiple dimensions at once in a way that the interiors have never been kind of represented before. So I'm just going to go through a number of these. There may be questions about specific architects or specific buildings. I'll get a little bit into that a little bit later and show you how we work with them within my design seminars. This is just the kind of survey itself. And, you know, within every one of these representations, even though some of them are perspectival, like this one, you know, there's an interesting idea of never putting back the viewer within the original intention. So you're almost seeing behind the curtain about how these things work. It's never the intentional subjective view that one anticipates or sees when one goes there. There's no intention for these to simulate reality or be virtual reality walkthroughs. They're more formal analytical devices to see and assess these, or I would say to make unfamiliar the already familiar of these kind of buildings, represent them in an unfamiliar way. The other kind of interesting vantage point one gets with these surveys is once the information has been collected, you can set viewpoints anywhere you want within these. So you can start to see the space from points that have not been viewed before or that have not been photographed in a sense. So you get these new vantage points and different ways to assess the space. I guess, you know, another point about this in terms of formal analysis, I think by its very nature ends up being reductive, right? What's interesting about scanning this, you get a certain amount of realism, right? It doesn't reduce that. You get everything within all the three-dimensional, all the figuration, all the colors, everything within those kind of things. Now, it is somewhat reductive in the sense that it only gives you surface properties, right? But it's interesting in relationship to formal analysis, which is typically compositional or relates somewhat to a kind of reductive version of understanding different sequences or different relationships. I think that type of architecture favors certain architects. Certainly someone like Borromini, who is the kind of master manipulator of geometry, you can break those down and really become reductive and look at geometry. Others, though, I would argue within the sort of Baroque kind of regime benefit more from this type of analysis, and we'll go into that a little bit with the tropes later. This is sort of another representational set that you're looking at. These are these kind of, I call them sort of spheroidic cosmologies. The central plan church within the Baroque is never quite perfect. It's never quite a perfect sphere or idealized. It's always being pushed or pulled in order to make it more dynamic, right? So that happens within plan and section, or sometimes either or for the most part. And so these things never have the perfectness that was intentioned with the Renaissance. They're always kind of distorted. They're always spheroidic, or almost spherical. And, you know, just from a kind of technological or methodological point, these are actually meshes that are created from the points, So one has to use cloud computing because each one of these scans has millions and millions and millions of points, and you essentially put them into kind of a black box process where you're asking cloud computing to start to join all those points. So where we saw the previous one, there are point clouds, and it gives you a unique kind of translucency or transparency. These are actually the meshes that are returned through cloud computing that are completely solid, but then still have the kind of texture maps of all the lighting and color configuration on those. You know, again, another view that's never been seen before. You're seeing the interior from the outside, and then this time you're getting all the articulation and all the color that comes with that in a straight orthogonal view. They're non-perspectival. These are twin churches in Piazza di Popolo by Rinaldi. Campitelli. It's interesting also, depending on what time you capture them, they have different lighting, right? So, and you can do a number of different scans at certain times. You know, this one's probably a really good example where the sun was coming in, you know, quite heavily, so it sort of fades out a lot of this, and you can see the, let's say, chiaroscuro effect that happens within a lot of these churches, that you're never really getting too much direct light, but the light that you are getting that's most bright or most direct happens in the ceiling areas, and those kind of those sort of cosmologies, this infinite extension, this idea that the interior, even though it's autonomous and isolated from the exterior as its own object, when you're in that, those interiors start to expand infinitely. So it's kind of an interesting notion that it's autonomous is separated from the exterior, but then ultimately it wants to expand into infinity through certain, let's say, Baroque tendencies, with the idea of chiaroscuro, which is that you are basically modulating certain ideas of light and shadow within these churches. They're very light parts, and then as you get into the corners and down below in these regions, they're much, much darker. So you start to get to see some of that happening within these. There are also other effects that happen within the kind of foreshortening or ideas of patterning and figuration as well. All of these kind of work in symphony to expand these spaces. I mean, these become pretty interesting as well. I mean, all of them are interesting. These are two Vittoni churches, which actually have nested shells within the shells. You can imagine they're almost like small vaulted pavilions within pavilions. And you start to see that within the way the scanner is registering. So, for instance, this one, it doesn't register any of the other shell that's behind the other shell because it's scanned from the, let's say, ceiling or different vantage points that are not in the attic. So you're getting to see the shell of what's visible from underneath and then recomposed with the fresco texture map on top of it. And then maybe a fourth kind of representational mode is the kind of physical modeling, right? And that was one of the first things that we wanted to do, was to be able to measure exactly all of these interior spaces and then make a closed model so that we could 3D print. So these are all solid resin or photopolymer resin 3D prints of those pieces. So, you know, obviously it has a dialogue with the original Moretti casts, but as you see, you know, these have different qualities. Obviously, probably the first is the detailed articulation. The second is that the resin is not opaque. It has a certain level of translucency. And actually, you know, this particular resin, these resin prints are supposed to, they're supposed to print completely transparent, but no one usually prints the resin like this. It's very expensive, and so people usually make the thinnest and least amount of resin they use, but we want to print them completely solid, so you start to get the depth. So it's almost like a pool in a certain way, where you get more transparency on the edges, but where it becomes really deep spatially, it gets very deep, kind of dark purple. And here are the same models illuminated. This one's really nice. You can see the different gradients given the different depth of space, and then obviously all the fine detail. Now, I would shift gears here, sort of maybe the second portion. So the first part is really the survey, and that's what's in the kind of book Baroque Topologies. Now the shift may be interesting for you guys in terms of formal analysis of working with students at Penn. So I also teach a seminar where I work with students. It's great. It can range from 16 to 20 different students at a time. And what I have the students do is I actually walk them through the kind of technological aspects of it, so they understand about scanning and how to work with point clouds and all of these. But they also get one of these churches by one of the 6 architects to start to analyze. So we kind of spread out and start to understand how each one of those architects are operating, what their tropes are, what are their tendencies, and how do these scans allow us to produce, let's say, new formal analysis, let's say non-reductive formal analysis in new different ways, and understand them in different ways. So I've kind of outlined some of the sort of more compelling examples from students by their tropes. So I'm just going to go through the 6 architects and show you a little bit what the students have done working with those. So for the first one, we start with Cortona. Cortona, like I said before, is primarily a painter. And this is San Luca e Martino, which is only kind of full freestanding construction. Here's the painting Allegory of the Divine, which is probably most famous. It's it's a kind of fresco on the ceiling of Palazzo Barbini. And you can see within that, he's using these kind of layers and architectural elements to start to create the illusion of depth, or the illusion that this is expanding into infinity. So you have figures that sit on top, in front, or behind these kind of architectural elements, back and forth, and creating these layers of depth. And then we look at the actual church, and you see this is his kind of, I think this one, the term painterly is one that Wolflin uses to describe Baroque, but I think this one is the most literally painterly church, where he's really using those kind of layers in order to create this dynamism and this sort of fluctuation in depth within the three-dimensional architecture. So this is one student that went through and started to determine where all those layers end up happening, kind of like the paintings, but happen within the actual interior. And it becomes infinitely expansive. These are the only 3 churches done by Bernini. So these are the only separate kind of freestanding churches. He's only done 3. Probably the most famous one is Sant'Andrea in Rome. There's another one in Aricia, which they say is this little Pantheon. And then there's another one that is kind of right sort of next to that in Castel Gandolfo, which is the Pope's sort of summer residence. So it's always, really nice to look at all of these together and kind of understand how he's working. So each one of them, these are altar pieces, one from the church in Castel Gandolfo, one from St. Andrew or San Andrea. You can see he works in what has been called the bel composto, which is a kind of combination of all the arts. So he's working to really put together painting, sculpture, and architecture, right? And so if you look over here, this really amazing altarpiece, you can see that these sort of figures, these cherubs, are these kind of plaster casts start to operate somewhat in between. So you can see this cherub, the hand is actually going onto the painting over the edge of the frame of the painting, and then wedged in between the kind of architectural elements sitting on the capital. The same thing happens down here with these figures. They start to go in these figures, one leg starts to drop off. And it's interesting because if you look at these projects just from maybe a typical formal analysis and reduce them, they're not very exciting geometrically. They're much less exciting than somebody like Borromini. They're not radical geometry. They're almost, someone like Vitkover says, they're almost classic parties of a cruciform, a circle plan, and an oval plan. But the exciting thing about Bernini is, in a true mannered or manneredist way, he sets up his rules. So he sets up the structure of architecture, the frames, the architectural elements, the cornices, all of these in a very classical way. And then he comes back in and he, let's say, disturbs or starts to question those thresholds and starts to tie them all together in a really interesting way with the figuration. I mean, here is one of my favorite examples in San Andrea. You see the kind of lantern above. This is the right above the main altar. The lantern brings in the light. It's a hidden source of light, indirect, very Baroque, but it brings it in, and he has these gold sort of shards of light rays that come through, and then on that are these sort of small bambino angels that start to gather on one another, and they start to become figure on figure, really like baby on baby, kind of falling through this this kind of classical structure and falling all the way through and doing some of the same thing that's happening over here, starting to surround that. And so you see this kind of really interesting notion of mixing all of the three arts together. And I think that this is something that's more difficult to understand formally without the scans. So I would say that, scanning someone like Bernini, in addition to the richness of the material palette and the painting and everything, that sort of realism of understanding the specific way he's operating as a sculptor is very important for his formal analysis. I think looking at a plan of his building or section, they're okay within the kind of classical order, but they're not the real radicalness, the real trope, or the real essence of Bernini is really in these kind of things. So these students started to go through and find all these moments of bel composto within each one of the three churches. They're sort of highlighting them. And then they took them all out and start to experiment on both like a cruciform or just a cube form, and saying, how do these kind of configurations start to challenge thresholds of edge, corner, face, all of these. So these were kind of their experiments within that. And you can see, so this is all of that from all three of those Bernini churches that starts to go. I mean, and you can see down here, I love the pieces sort of drip off, and they even start to challenge the typography of the slide. It's nice. This is another group that was working in a similar way, looking at combining the two domes from Aricia and the Gandolfo, then looking at bringing in these figuration, starting to challenge these kind of edges and thresholds here. You can see this additional figuration. So they're taking pieces from all three of them and starting to work and understand this. And I think it's a really interesting way of starting to understand how Bernini works. So obviously, Borromini, we have, most extensive works are by Borromini, which has been really kind of a pleasure to kind of look through and work with students. Certainly, Borromini is probably the most interesting geometrically, the most ambitious. He's a master of geometry, comes from a stonemason background. He knows, his geometry, how to cut stone, how to build, and he's really a master of this. So you can see, you know, these are some of the drawings that we're doing. It seems straightforward, but there really hasn't ever been, let's say, a ceiling plan that has projected of exactly what's there. There's been drawings of this, but it's almost photographic, but it's in orthogonal view with that sort of governing geometry of the two triangles and those way in which they create this kind of star, which was seen as a symbol of knowledge. At a certain point, we can go into a lot more about any of Borromini's buildings. They're very, very complex. You could do a whole lecture easily on any of them. These are some of the work by the students that started to take, if you look diagonally across this, you'll see the three actual buildings. This is San Carlino, San Ivo, and the Ramage Chapel. And they started to look at those governing geometries and they started to combine them to say, well, what if Ramage was done with San Ivo's parts or San Carlino's parts? Or let's say San Ivo was done with Carlino's points, and starting to interchange different kind of vaulting sequences to make these new hybrids of Borromini through their geometry. One thing I think is also interesting about Borromini is that not too many people allude to this. Most people are really fascinated with his geometry and the kind of underlying governing geometry of his work. But just like Bernini, the details are really, really fascinating what's happening. He always has this kind of pulsing on and off. So something in the balustrade, if you look at the balustrade, they're always, something that kind of took from Michelangelo, but they're alternating up, down, up, down. You can look at the cornices where he's taking, let's say, ionic fluting, and he's changing the scrolls up and down, up and down. There are certain areas with the niches are moving up and down, up and down. Something like the wings of these angels, some are crossed, some are open, cross, open. This happens within the vaulting structure where he's pushing in and out, inside and then outside, right? So all of this is happening. You know, the details of Borromini are really fascinating. They help complement this sort of constant pressure that's expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. And so these are some of the projects by a student who took all of those moments within all of those Borromini works and start to put them together and start to see them outside of the context of their, let's say, unique work, and see them all together combined, which I think is for me is an interesting formal analysis of Borromini, and kind of presents his work in a little bit different light than we typically see formal analysis of Borromini. Rinaldi is the kind of let's say fourth architect from Rome. Rinaldi's incredibly fascinating. I know you guys had Eisenman in the series, and you were talking about his Virtual Palladio book. If you read the introduction to Virtual Palladio, he praises Rinaldi, right? So he actually talks about this right here, number 14, Campitelli, as having a lot of these kind of Palladian aspects and influence from the north. And he even admits in the intro, he talks about it's really odd to begin a book on Palladio with Rinaldi's work. So he's a really interesting architect that really knows and has a real grasp. That's why I call him the architect of the group, that has a real grasp on the sort of syntax and formal language of architecture. And then he brings that to Rome and starts to mix that a little bit with what's happening there with the specifically Roman kind of work of people like Borromini and Bernini. This particular one is really fascinating, where if you look at a number of different people that have written about Rinaldi, they talk about he's making, in a sense, these difficult wholes. So his projects, in a weird way, take pieces that don't necessarily go together to create one whole. They seem almost like a Frankenstein or a mismatch of all of these very non-proportioned, weird, different things coming together. And one of the interesting things is, these kind of ambiguous elements then all get sewn together by this just really, really deep, heavy cornice. So the deep, heavy cornice kind of stitches together these odd size, shaped, odd proportioned elements. So these students started to take all of those pieces together of that sort of heavy cornice and those odd pieces of Rinaldi and start to create this labyrinth with them, which is a really fascinating way to read this kind of, let's say if you take somebody like Venturi would call this a difficult whole, right? And, you know, it's interesting, Rinaldi is a, you know, it's a critique of the idea of the kind of classical part to whole relationships of Vitruvius and then kind of formulated by Alberti. And in it, you know, there's an idea that, you know, maybe perfection is not obtainable, this kind of perfect whole. And it's an interesting kind of critique. There's a weird crudeness within his architecture. So finally, the two architects that are in the Piedmont area are Guarini and Vittoni. These are some of the, you know, I think Guarini is probably the second most interesting in terms of geometry. He's, you know, a mathematician and a priest on top of being an architect as well. Most of his work deals with polar coordinates, which they're always these centers that end up pushing in and pulling off of each other. This one is an analysis of San Lorenzo. So here you go, kind of more typical idea of formal analysis of really understanding this. You know, this student then takes that and actually takes the scan and starts to take those pieces and understand if they're on polar coordinates, can they start to rotate in a speculative way. So this takes all of the pieces of that church of those polar coordinates and re-rotates them in different ways. So turning already what is only the kind of, let's say, form of the interior with no exterior, kind of rotating that and turning that inside out as well. And these are some of the kind of pieces and kind of the combinatorial logic that happens within that. This is another group that also was looking at those polar coordinates and combining Lorenzo with another very small church there that's in Torino, which is the Immaculate Conception, but looking at those polar coordinates and placing them in scale with one another, and you can kind of see how it hybridizes those two logics. And then finally, you know, the Bernardo Vittoni, which I call him the Lumineer. His biggest kind of advancement of this and his trope is really opening up the vaulting and getting layered vaults so that you have poche or thickness between different vaults. And that vault is then start to become filled with light that then starts to bounce around in different ways. And so, you know, this particular one is looking at, the third church, which is San Maria Piazza in Torino. And it's just fascinating because there's so many different vaults that occur within that one church. It's just a complete bouillabaisse of different types of vaults. So this is just indexing and looking at all of the kind of vaults and looking at these new vault objects that happen within that. You know, probably the most signature move by Vittoni is if you look at the corner, what typically is a pendentive, which is basically a geometric device in order to negotiate going from a dome, which is spherical, to a plan that isn't spherical or isn't a circle. So you have pendentives, which kind of transition that geometry in. Vittoni, you know, this sacred kind of structural element, Vittoni takes that and pierces those pendentives. So he actually puts a hole through those and actually puts light through them. So it's an interesting play on, you know, what's structural, that's just, you know, the daringness of the kind of thinness. You know, again, it's not reinforced concrete. This is still load-bearing masonry, very, very thin masonry shells that start to work in these really interesting ways. So these are kind of just some of the close-ups of those figures, and then larger figures of putting them together, these kind of new sort of Frankensteins of all of those vaultings. This is another kind of student project that's looking at other of Vittoni. That one was all for one church. This was actually combining vaulting for all four of the Vittoni kind of churches, these very thin shells, understanding how they can nest within one another and be reappropriated. You see here in the center, you can see those pierced pendentives again. Some of the really fine kind of masonry work taken out and kind of starts to almost become embroidery, like, or almost, let's say, textile. And that's the sort of collection. And I'll just close maybe here and just say that what I wanted to show you kind of a new series that I've been working on with the students in the seminar last spring, and had fun time with my research assistants this summer, kind of cleaning up and standardizing these. And I think that they're in direct dialogue again with that sort of Moretti cast, but in a certain way, they're very different, because obviously they're not streamlined in the way that Moretti, a modernist, would take out all the detail. They show the exterior and the interior at the same time, but not in the way the point clouds do. These are actually solid objects. So the idea, we call these our kind of kaleidoscopic series, where we're trying to show kaleidoscopic views, and they're all true axons, are true isometrics, where the actual models have been distorted and they're measurable models. They're non-perspectival, right? So I'm just going to go through this. This is, just the series of all of the previous architects that you saw before, but these are our new series. And then here are some isometrics that show all the figures and some new sections, somewhat traditional, but they're really fascinating to see because they haven't been ever documented in this way. All the main altar apses. Right. And then, of course, this research, I have a tremendous amount of people. It's been great working with Penn students. It's been great over in Rome. I had taught there before 10 years ago and lived there, and had established a number of contacts over there. Faro, the laser scanning company, has been amazing. Autodesk has been helpful in order to lend us their kind of cloud computing. And so there's just, this research, I can't even begin to start a list there, but there's been so many people involved within the kind of last years of, just because it's just such an immense amount of data. I mean, it's huge, big data, this archive. And so it's been an incredible amount of support for the work. So I'd like to just acknowledge that. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was really amazing lecture, and it is really mind-blowing also to say this, like at first look you think that just this cloud survey and laser scanning is analysis already, but when we look at the students' work, it's amazing how we can interpret this work and how we can go further in analysis, and this was really interesting. And now we can give the right for questions for audience. Is there a question?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I was watching the Eisman lecture, and you guys had a great question for him, asking him, how do you learn about architecture if you don't have the sort of luxury of Colin Rowe taking you out to the Palladian villas and asking them this. I mean, this is the beginning of maybe an answer to that. The Penn students, we do a Penn seminar, we're not in Rome, we're not looking at these. And I just have to say, giving them this full set of data with the kind of realism and the specific figuration, geometry, color, all of that they're able to understand that. Again, it's not about virtual reality and trying to recreate the experience, because I think there's still no substitute for that. One needs to go and see these buildings, but maybe another best thing is to have the full scans as well, but also more from an analytical standpoint of really understanding how these really, really incredibly complex autonomous interiors really operate. It's really a good. So I think that, I think that when you're talking about the students' analysis, I love Peter's work, and I show them Peter's, and I show them someone like Preston Scott Cohen, who I work for, also does beautiful analytical work through the lens of projective geometry on the Baroque. And I say, this is all great, but none of them, ever had access to this information. So we need to do something different, or else, so that's kind of maybe our answer, our sort of third chapter in that sort of lineage.
Thank you very much for this, for sharing to us this amazing survey that you did with all of these participants and the parts involved. It was really amazing. I mean, like seeing all of these sections, the cloud points, assuming all of these articulations of those buildings was really nice to see. And I would have one question about this role of formal analysis in contemporary architecture, maybe. What do you think? What could be the ultimate analysis of this space? And the second question, I would suggest, what could be the suggestion for architects while designing what they should kind of go through? What could be the kind of analysis that should they kind of assume and imagine all of this kind of formal analysis as the part of the design process, or could it be kind of hidden, or how Borromini or Bernini could imagine all of this analysis? I mean, would they imagine kind of spaces that you explored, or was it intentional to make this kind of sculptural spaces, interior spaces, or was it kind of intentional? And what could be the formal reading of the spaces that architects should involve while designing all of this, while going through this design phases?
No, those are great questions. Yeah, I tried to unpack that question. There's a lot of questions in there. The role of formal analysis, I think is obviously, I'm an advocate of that. But I do think that, formal analysis, even starting, where do you start? You can start, with Wolflin. There's certain pressures of society at that point. I mean, he was operating under, the sort of new scientific revolution. Art was not necessarily seen at the same universality to be taught in universities. So they were deploying these kind of psychoanalytical techniques in order to raise art from a connoisseurial level of just collectors to having and demonstrating that it has universal value, right? And so they are taking more of a scientific approach to their analysis, right? Where, someone, you can look at then what's the difference between that and then someone like Vitkover, and, go all the way, Colin Rowe, Eisenman, there's a whole lineage of this. And if you look at that, Preston Scott Cohen, all of these, I would argue that the sort of contemporary pressures and the contemporary tools of representation are all different at when they're operating. And so they all have different objectives for analysis. So I don't think one can teach analysis that's simple sort of, rules or facts. I think, we learn a lot about ourselves when we start to reassess those kind of the contemporary paradigm and put it upon these. And one of the things that's great about, this collection of Baroque buildings is there's so much multiplicity and so much complexity. Every generation has thrown themselves in a way. I mean, if you read Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction, these buildings are in almost every single chapter, right? So, whether it's the 80s, the 90s, there was certainly, a large kind of interest in the Baroque that had to also do with Deleuze's kind of book at that time, The Fold, that dealt also in dialogue with ideas of continuity that were coming out of computation at that time. I would argue that for me now, I was kind of part of that, but also that this is a different way of looking at, not looking at the Baroque as totally continuous, which I would argue is more of a modern sensibility of the idea of going from inside to outside streamline continuity that somebody like Zaha Hadid or somebody picks up of dynamics and melting flows and animation. Those are all modernist tendencies, and I think it's not necessarily Baroque, but they wanted to find forms and figures that made a better argument for that. But I would argue that the Baroque is much more discrete than that sort of interpretation. My only point is that each kind of generation looks at formal analysis or looks at buildings in different ways given all the aspects they have. So it's not really, there's no real set rules. And that's the nice thing about it, is that you have to do it more than just taking a history class, right? You have to set aside time, and that's a luxury. It's really an academic luxury time to where you can sit and look at all of these 18 buildings for a semester, right? You don't graduate and go to an office and start a project looking at all of these projects. There's a real luxury that happens in academic space, and I encourage you to take advantage of that. But that being said, what are the explicit, maybe one of your other questions, just to unpack a little bit, what are the explicit relationship between doing this type of analysis and then an actual architectural design, right? And I would argue, what's nice about, the way that I teach, I mean, first of all, the survey in itself is just there as information, as kind of adding another piece for architectural knowledge for the sort of profession, the discourse, this kind of thing. The work that we do in the seminar in terms of the, let's say, more generative analysis is never intended necessarily to lead to a building. It's really meant to lead in the sort of psychoanalytical mind frame of actually interrogating, asking questions of these buildings, and using this new set of information, this realism and high definition and big data, as a new way to ask different questions than were asked before, right? And the work that they produce, let's say these analytical objects that are neither re-representations of the old building nor speculative ideas for a new building, they just exist as objects of analysis, and I'm fine with that within that space. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have any use for actual, design of architecture. Part of the thing that this course that I'm trying to teach them is the Baroque is still affecting you today. The formalist discourse operated and comes out of that whole thing, and formalism is still happening today. So, whether it's, in different, like the American avant-garde or New York Five or any of these kind of legacies of that, you have to go back and understand where that works. And I think that, my other point on that, when you understand, typically one looks at the Baroque, and if you don't look at it that closely, somebody, let's say, doesn't study these buildings, would think that they all kind of look the same, right? You have to really look closely to understand how each one of the architects are operating in a different way, and they have certain tropes or certain ways that they want to produce certain architectural consequences, and you have to break it down and start to understand the differences in the way that they're operating. And when you do that, I think that those kind of things on a more abstracted level, the idea of being a mannerist, about, let's say, making your own rules and then breaking your own rules, that's like the kind of major mannerist kind of mode of operation, right? Those things are entirely useful for architects today. Coming to a site, you always have restrictions and these kind of things, understanding where they are, where you can break them, where you operate, and all of these things. So I think that, that's just one example, but these kind of tropes of painterly layers, breaking down thresholds, understanding, how to manipulate geometry, all of these kind of things that are happening are not necessarily relegated to the 17th century. I think they're sort of truisms of architecture will always be there.
Thank you for this interesting answer.
I think there is one question online. You partly touched this topic, but I think it's interesting to hear more deeply your thoughts. So, as a person asks, it would be interesting to hear your opinion more broadly about architecture. Is the focal point of architecture space in the interior, also as Bruno Zevi explains in his book, or it could be about something else? And what are your thoughts about contemporary architecture? Could we say that it follows this tradition of space-oriented architecture?
Yeah, that's a big question. I like the allusion to Bruno Zevi. Certainly, he with Moretti were very good friends. And Bruno Zevi has that whole book on space. Moretti names his magazine Spazio, which is space. And there was a point, when space was a huge sort of focus. I think that it's kind of, it sounds kind of odd probably for architects to think that there were time in architecture when space wasn't important. But I think, that it is something that I think needs to be contemporized. What is our idea of space now? I think at different times, whether it's the Baroque, the Baroque was dealing with a lot, very complex, situation socially. Somebody, some historians would call it maybe the first modern architecture, which is a very weird way to think of the Baroque, right? One doesn't necessarily associate it with modernism, but given the complexity of society at that point, what it was doing, how it was dealing with technology, mathematics, all of these kind of things, and religion, all of those together, one could point at that as modern, right? And so I think one has to consider, what would be those kind of larger factors here. Certainly, there's always the relationship of humans to architecture, right? At certain points, humans have been very central. Other points, they're kind of a little bit outside. I think right now, with the sort of, the global situation, the ecology, all of this, I think those things, there are larger things where maybe humans are not at the center. Doesn't mean they don't have them, but they may enter at the oblique or in tandem with other kind of priorities within that. I think certainly, I think contemporary people need to learn to really love architecture in a certain way. I think there's a lot of, emphasis on, well, let's not look at it that it's plagued with certain things, and this happens in politics, not just architecture. Who does one study? Who becomes relevant? Somebody like Wolflin, had some problematic ideology. Someone would say that he's probably racist. Should we look at them anymore? These kind of things. I think there's a lot of that happening. How do we understand the canon of architecture without putting it on a pedestal, but acknowledge there are certain things that are operating that are interesting? How do we reinterpret the canon of architecture and not make it something that is inflexible? There's a number of different things. I don't know. That's a tough kind of question about how one views contemporary architecture. But I think that there are certain paradigm considerations that one has to take into effect, but without starting new are starting to say, well, it's tabula rasa and nothing that happened before is important. I mean, yeah.
Thanks. I also have one question, like also about it. I think you already spoke when you answered to Nadar, and we also seen it in some of the students' work, but maybe we could also speculate a little bit further about this topic. So for me, it was really interesting when I saw all the survey tools which you show in your presentation, and for instance, camera obscura, which was used, or the Roman tools with which they created the circular shapes and linear shapes. Can we say that this amazing method which you used in your surveys could be further used not only as a survey tool, but also as a tool to generate new shapes and new kind of architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of first of all, a lot of this technology is increasingly becoming less expensive and more accessible to architects. The laser scanner that I took, I actually borrowed it from Faro, the company. I don't have my own laser scanner. I wrote them a letter and told them that I wanted to do this project to scan a building. And they said, you can have it to scan one building. And I scanned a lot of buildings within a month and a half. I was up all night and all morning just running around scanning as much as I could with this. Got to use it. Now that's like a $50,000 machine, and I was always leery of that. I always had it in my backpack, did not want this thing to be stolen, but they've come down quite a bit. And, we're going to be, at a certain point where that technology is very, very accessible, and it's already beginning to be. I mean, photogrammetry, I think the new iPhone 12 just has a NASA level LiDAR in it, right? So, there's a point when, maybe this analysis has a certain shelf life where you guys are just going to go to Rome and do this with your camera and capture all that. And I think the question that this, back to your original question, is what do we do with that as architects? How do we start to take ownership with that? And I think that it can fit within, my own trajectory of being, having, been taught by Peter, worked for them, taught at Cooper Union, worked for Preston Scott Cohen, who's kind of also in that. It's just sort of part of my lineage to say, okay, well, how can we use this within formal analysis? And probably the major point is that these types of technologies are really used primarily as empirical measuring devices, right? That you would go out and you measure the site, you get as-built conditions. And actually, the stuff that we were doing with Autodesk, when we first started doing this, we were putting the point clouds back into their cloud computing. The reason why they set this cloud computing up is that they had a lot of people, engineers that were surveying oil platforms and these kind of things, and they needed to have meshes made because they need to put new infrastructure and pipes into these really complex infrastructural machines, and they had to do that in order to detect collision. You had to have a mesh. You can't detect collisions with point clouds. So Autodesk set that up to make meshes for oil platforms, to get meshes so they could do that. They were never meant to do Baroque churches. So when we started sending these to the cloud, their engineers, they were like looking at oil platforms, and all of a sudden, Borromini church shows up, they're, what is this thing there? So I think, that intentionality of the instrument really is one, of empirical measuring device, and is very, very accurate. It's a really wonderful tool. But I think, as you said, the whole reason for doing that kind of abbreviated diagram of showing all those surveying is that surveying is pre-geometry, surveying is pre-architectural representation. Surveying is so endemic to what we do as architects. Somehow engineers have more or less kind of taken that over, but surveying is at the root of architectural representation. So that's what I was arguing, long story short, is can we use this device not only to measure, which is great, and people can use these models if they want to measure and try to prove a point of whether Borromini did this or this. There's a lot of people in historic preservation that measure this to verify the geometry. You know, was he drawing with the ellipse or was it an oval? These kind of things. And I think those things are fine. And there's definitely a field of scholarship there, and it's very pragmatic and empirical. But I wanted to look at it and just say, how does this really produce architectural representation? How does it let us see in a different way? How does it unlock certain ideas about the way that we understand this? How can we understand, you know, analysis, formal analysis, being less reductive? Even though I admit that there are things that are reductive about this process, but when you capture all the material, all of the figuration to the exact finish, what does that mean? I would argue that it advocates for some architects. Some architects are more easily analyzed in that sense, and it actually is complementary to them, and you're able to understand, instead of saying, well, Borromini was a great geometer, and then look at somebody like Bernini and say, well, he was kind of boring, he wasn't very good at geometry. Well, that wasn't his thing, you know. I mean, it wasn't his, that's not how he operated. But if you look at the paintings, the figuration, the tropes, the colors, all of those kind of things, that's where someone like Bernini kind of comes alive. So, you know, longer kind of answer to your question is, yeah, I think, you know, these tools should be used and should at least question architectural representation, because we're going to have to. I mean, it's already there. I mean, you know, this was done probably 3 years ago when I did the survey. You know, people are doing this now and doing it with much less expensive, easy accessible material. So what do we do with this as architects, outside of it just being measuring and giving us this, which that's is very important. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's nothing more amazing than to be able to set up a scanner on the floor and go 30 meters up and then go run to your computer and have a model of exactly what's there. That's incredible. So I'm not trying to undermine that usefulness of the tool, but I think we can push further and say, as architects, you know, does this come into formal analysis, representation, all the other things that we've done? You know?
That's really, really mind-blowing and very interesting. So anyone else has questions?
Just one question. How long it takes to do like one building this way?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really, really good question. I'm glad you asked that. I mean, like 20 years? No, I mean, there's a lot of things that built up. I mean, first of all, there's always sometimes, you know, you get people and be like, what's the big deal? You scan some buildings. You know, it takes a long time to make the relationships in order to be able to access this. I mean, most of these churches are not only have their own diocese and their own kind of, you know, certain structures that you have to go through, hierarchies all the way up to the Vatican, but they're also owned by the state. So you have to also get state permission. And that just doesn't happen by email in Italy. I mean, I love the Italians, but you cannot email them from Pennsylvania and get this permission. You have to get there, see them, go door to door, meet them, say, okay, you know, I mean, that's the way that it works. So probably the most time consuming is just actually getting permission to really get in there. I mean, and then also having a really great, extensive, wonderful group of Italian collaborators that were over there. I mean, some of these churches are not accessible to the public. You know, they've been closed forever. No one, I mean, some of them like the Rimage or, you know, some of the other ones are a little bit far out. I'm just trying to think of the oratory. That main space has been closed for so long. You can't just show up in Rome and go to do that. You know, I don't know exactly why, but all of that is a lot. So now that's one huge part of it. And then, you know, there were times in this when let's just say I had a summer, I went over there, I was supposed to have the scanner. They allowed me to borrow it for 1 month, and probably 15 days or half of a month, I've still been trying to get permissions, and I haven't scanned one thing. So I was sitting in Rome with this $50,000 scanner in my apartment. I'm just scanning my apartment because I was about to cry. I was like, this is going to be a total failure because I haven't gotten into any of these. And then finally things started going well. You know, I had a good friend who had gotten baptized in the Bernini Aricia. And he knew a priest who called these guys and this and that. some things like Santiago is notoriously difficult to get into, but had some good friends that the second floor of Santiago is actually owned by the state as their archives. So when I went and asked the priest, he was like, maybe you come back next year. That was his answer to me. And I was like, I can't have a collection of Baroque churches without Santiago, right? And so they have 3 balconies that are on the second floor. And if you look in with the laser scanner, I cranked up the tripod as much as it could go and stick the laser scanner out over those balconies. So I got the 3 points there, and they allowed me, like 30 minutes. So I was able to get each one of the balconies and put it together just with 3 scans, and was able to get that. So, there's some of them were so hard to, some of them, like the ones in Vitoni, I scanned all of it. The priests were really happy, and then, came in at like 2 a.m. in the evening and says, oh, I forgot to turn on all the other lights. So he turned on all the other lights and then when it scanned again. So some of them were very accessible. Some of them are, and didn't really necessarily relate to the importance of those churches as well, just different bureaucracy. So now that being set aside, that's what takes the time and the effort. The scanning itself, literally, if you have all of that underway, the scanner is like, I maybe make the kind of comparison of saving a JPEG. You can save a JPEG at different levels of resolution and compression. The scanner has, different levels of resolution and accuracy and time that you want to go around. So depending on what the project is, right? So if you're dealing with, a sculpture that's very close, you might want super, super high resolution and takes a very long time to go through. What I did, the setting that I had on, which worked really well for these churches, is usually about 15 minutes to go. It goes around once, and then the laser shoots up and you get the points. And then the second rotation, it goes around and takes a full kind of panorama photograph so that it can map the colors onto those textures. So those kind of take about 30 minutes. Now you need, like Santiago, I had 3 scans. That was the minimum, but it's a straight line. Obviously laser is a straight line. So when you're scanning, you need to put it in multiple different locations. If you can't see around the corner or behind, you have to put it there. So one of the nice things about doing these churches is obviously for the most part, they're symmetrical and they have really nice floor tiling that you can pick out all the points and find them all through there. So, ones that allow me, some of the churches, they have up to 20 scans. Others, some of them let me in during a siesta, and I could only scan for an hour, so I had to set and quickly go. So they all are different. So I would say, really, a short answer to you is probably about 30 minutes for one station. And then the question is, how many stations do you need to get to really get the 3-dimensional? And then if you have any more time, you can break it down into a little bit and make sure you don't get it. And, I don't live in Rome, so I would go back and check, every night, make sure to look at the scans and see, do we forget everything? Are they open? But that part of it, is actually pretty quick in the sense of what you would think. The other major time-consuming thing is like, what do you do with this? It's big, huge, enormous data. And, there was parts when I got back to Philadelphia and starting to put these together and saying, how do we get these meshes out of, this is, 3 or 4 years ago. So this has become a little bit easier, but, and I was just like, now I have all this data. How am I going to prove this? Because our first thing we want to do at proof of concept is, can we build 3D solid model like Moretti, at least do that. And it was tough because there was nothing that could mesh them. And Autodesk was really super friendly. I reached out to them, and and the stuff that they were doing right at that point was all behind the scenes. It wasn't accessible to anybody. They were just working on it, and they were allowing us to get through. And black box computing is really difficult too, because you can send in, a portion of the scan. You can wait. At that time, we'd wait sort of a day, and then you get a message back that, congratulations, here's your mesh, or sorry, it didn't work. And so we have to break it down to smaller and smaller. So it's a weird, long kind of process. And I had really amazing research assistants, contacts, and all of this kind of stuff. So the literal scanning part doesn't take that much. The research and getting access, and then how you want to post process and work with the data, those things are expensive in terms of time.
Thank you. It's really inspiring. I mean, I would like to challenge my team to do the same in Georgia, maybe with the Georgian Arch churches. So I know that there are some people who started doing it on like Georgian churches mostly, but now like within the workshop we are mostly working on the Soviet modernism, so it's a big gap between those two. So anyways, I would like to thank you very much, and I wanted to mention that your works, of course, together with these images, have been really inspirational during the workshop for the participants, and I would like to thank you for this interesting lecture and for being with us today. And I think we don't have any more questions online.
Yeah, I guess so.
So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for watching. That was our last lecture within this workshop, lecture by Andrew Saunders about Baroque Topologies. And yeah, we will see you next time.
Yeah, I'll see you on the 30th on Friday for the final jury. I'm looking forward to seeing all the work. Thank you again for inviting me to the Biennial and to be part of such a really, really amazing set of lectures and a really interesting topic that I love to talk about.
We're very lucky to have you. Thanks a lot.
All right, bye guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day. Bye.
Good.
Lecture.